Welcome to Millennium Physician Group Radio. I'm Michelle McCormick. Today our conversation is about funerals. Well, mostly about arranging and pre-planning. We're going to learn about the funeral home business by talking with one of Jacksonville's oldest businesses, Noggle Funeral Home and Cremation Services, and we're going to learn about the importance of being prepared. But first, Millennium Physician Group is one of the largest physician groups in Florida with over 150 offices in the state. We have over 50 primary care providers right here in Northeast Florida. Millennium definitely has an office for you. Just go to millenniumphysician.com to find a location. We also just opened our first walk-in medical center in Jacksonville. The center offers extended hours during the week and on Saturdays to help with your primary care and acute care needs, located on Atlantic Boulevard near Hodges. Millennium Physician Group is your connection to a healthier life. Join us right now for a healthcare journey as we work together to achieve the best health outcome for you. All right, so death. It's a topic most people really don't want to have, but it's more important than ever to have this conversation and be prepared for your loved ones and even for your own well-being, your final rest. Our guests today are experts in the funeral home and cremation service field. So first, let's meet Cameron Noggle. He's the president and owner of Noggle Funeral Home and Cremation Services. And joining Cameron today is Taylor Sawyer. She's a licensed funeral director and embalmer. I'm going to learn way more about that, I'm sure, at Noggle as well. So welcome, guys, to the show. Thank you so much. All right, Cameron.
Okay.
We kind of, by your last name, we know you're part of the family. Give us some history about you and how you got into the family business.
Sure. I'm fourth generation, so I grew up in a funeral family. You know, some parents have a body shop, some parents own a grocery store. My parents happen to own a funeral home. My great-grandparents, believe it or not, they were licensed funeral directors and embalmers in Chicago. And in 1918, when Prohibition got a little wild, they got on a train, and this is where that train stopped. They rode it as far as it would go. Mr. Burns, who was in the area, had a burial society. They saved up, driving people from here to Daytona for a year to buy into his funeral home and opened up Noggle Funeral Home on Hendricks.
Wow, and it's still there to this day.
Yeah,
you see it on I-95 leaving downtown all the time. So institution, if you will, in Jacksonville. So how, fourth generation, what drove you to follow in the footsteps of those before you?
I did other things. I went to college, got a business bachelor's, did banking and finance and logistics. And after working as a young man in funeral service, I told my wife one day, you know what, I miss funeral service. And she said, you're crazy. And I said, I know, you're a very understanding wife. People have callings in their lives. Like people get callings to be ministers or to be physicians. And just at that point, I told my wife, this is what I really want to do.
So do you go to school for that?
I did. I went to school early on, and then my dad said, well, go to school for this and get a license, and if you don't want to do it, you can go back to school while doing this and do other things. But at least you have something to fall back on if one day, it comes to you. Mm-hmm. So I said, you're crazy, that'll never happen.
Are you the only sibling that followed the footsteps?
Yeah, I have a sister. She's 2 years younger than me, but she's in medicine. She's in hospital administration, and but she didn't go into funeral service. So maybe one day she will.
Maybe. You never know. She has children too, I'm sure. Yes. All right. So joining us is also Taylor Sawyer, and a licensed funeral director and embalmer. So Taylor, give us a little bit of your history too.
Well, I've only been licensed for like 4 years now, I think. I originally was going to school to be a teacher. And when I started substitute teaching, I'm not that old, but the kids these days are not the best behaved, I guess you could say.
It's very difficult.
Yes, it is. So I didn't have the best experiences in personal funerals that I had attended. And I took an intro class to mortuary science in Indiana, and it clicked. Like Cameron was saying, you have to have like a passion for it. And not everyone does. It's not something, most people are like, how do you do that? It's something in you that when you start doing it, it just feels right. And I think the best thing for me is, seeing the families after that are so thankful for what we do. And that's kind of how I got in the business. And then I started embalming for Cameron a while ago, and he needed some assistance. So I decided Noggle was a good option. I mean, they've been in the city for a while, so I figured if they're good people and they've been here this long, it's a good opportunity. So
well, okay, so you brought up a good point. Let's start with that. So what do funeral homes do? I went to your website. It's extremely extensive.
Yeah.
I have been to funerals, but you guys offer just more than burial services.
Correct.
So tell us a little bit about the business of a funeral home.
Yeah, so we help with pre-arrangements, which we'll talk about later, but we also do, when someone passes, we do cremations. Our funeral home has a crematory on site, which is very rare for most funeral homes because you do have to get permitting and stuff like that to do that. We also do preparations for if someone wants to be shipped to another state or a different country. We do that as well. Pre-arrangements. We've even assisted on Cameron's in a couple groups around town. They'll have their get-togethers at our funeral homes. So we do stuff like that too.
Okay.
Yeah.
So all right, let's go from start to finish, if you will. Let's say my grandmother passes away.
Yes.
And I choose your funeral home as the place where I'm going to take care of all my business. Yeah. What is the first step?
So normally it all depends on where the person passes. If they pass in a facility, nursing home, hospital, places like that, the facility will contact us and give us your loved one's information, name, date of birth, things like that. And then we have a team that comes out and picks your loved one up, or usually around 90 minutes is the average time. They are brought into our care and they don't leave our facility. We have refrigeration and things like that on site. Then we contact the family to set up an appointment to go over what your wishes are, whether that be cremation or burial or like we talked about, ship out. And then there's quite a bit of paperwork we have to fill out, contracts that have to be signed and things like that before we can do anything. If someone passes at home and they're not under hospice care or under care of a physician, JSO has to be contacted and notified, and then JSO contacts the funeral home.
Okay.
Some people don't, when their loved one dies at home, they don't know what to do.
No idea. Yeah.
So if they're not under the care of someone, you do have to contact the police. They do have to come out and do a small investigation just to make sure it was of natural causes, and then they'll contact the funeral home.
Okay. All right. And we are definitely going to get into the pre-planning because I'm sure that's a step somewhere along the way when you have an idea of where of those. But what's a mortuary? So
mortuary there are two terms, and they're used interchangeably nowadays. But originally, I could tell you the history and the etymology of it. But a mortuary is a place that was specifically built to have funerals at. Like ours is technically a mortuary. We were built to have funerals. It was never a home. A funeral home is a term they used to use for a home that's been converted as a place for the community to hold funerals at.
Okay.
They use the terms interchangeably nowadays, but originally that was the two definitions. The mortuary was built as a place to offer funeral merchandise and to hold funerals that wasn't somebody's home. And a funeral home was an old house that was converted by the community. Usually several undertakers would hold services there, and it would be the community funeral home.
Okay, but mortuary and morgue are different.
Right.
Yes, so the morgue is where, like at a hospital or even the medical examiner's office, a morgue is where someone is held until, after passing, until they go to the funeral home.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't have a morgue.
No ME on site?
No.
Right. Okay, so why is the crematory on site important?
It's important because if your funeral home has a crematory on site, your loved one never leaves that facility. There's no interchanging between companies. Some funeral homes contract a crematory to do their cremations, which is fine, but then there's a chance of, if your person doesn't go to the right place or things like that. So it's best to have a crematory on site. You know exactly where your loved one is the whole time during the entire process. So identification is important, things like that. So it's best to have a crematory there. Yeah,
that makes sense. We are talking with Cameron Noggle and Taylor Sawyer, both of Noggle Funeral Home and Cremation Services. I know this is going to be a personal choice, but why choose a burial over cremation or vice versa?
It is a personal choice. I think it just depends on what you as an individual and your family wants. Some people are, for religious purposes, they do burial over cremation or vice versa.
Yeah, or some people for economic reasons.
Yeah.
They choose cremation. Cremation is usually less than burial.
As far as price.
Price-wise.
Yeah.
There are hybrids. We've done services where we do everything we would do for a normal funeral, but they say, instead of going left to the cemetery, you go right to the crematory. And so they even make ceremonial caskets that look like regular caskets that you would have a burial in, except for the insert comes out and it's crematable. So
Yeah,
you can do
so
a
just
hybrid of
because
the two.
just because you do cremation doesn't mean you can't have a full service viewing and all of that. You can still have the same things as a burial. You just, after the service, you do cremation.
Okay, so, and then what's involved with the embalmment process?
So embalming, one, it helps with preservation, but it also, if you're having a viewing, usually it makes the person look better.
Yeah.
There's dyes and things in the chemicals that, make a rosier appearance and things like that. It is exchanging of chemicals for, blood and things like that. It is a long process. It takes a couple hours, but it does make the person look a lot better. And because of, diseases and things like that, you do have to have embalming under certain circumstances. If you're doing flights to other countries and things like that, they do require that just for health reasons.
Right, of course, that makes sense. Now, with all of that, I honestly have never been to an open casket.
Sure.
How do you prepare people who are coming to a funeral and it might be open casket? How do you prepare people for that?
I think the best is to be honest.
Yeah.
Some people, they don't want to hear, especially if it's a traumatic passing, they don't want to hear that their loved one isn't viewable or things like that. But at the same time, they would rather you pre-warn them than them get there and, what they see is not, what they
had in
thought.
mind or what they were envisioning.
Yeah.
That's the hardest thing is telling families that are really set on seeing somebody that maybe this isn't the best idea. We do our best and we're very talented. But at the end of the day, sometimes you just have what you have.
Yeah.
And does that require like makeup and cosmetics? And
Yeah, so sometimes if it's a traumatic accident, there is restoration that we have to do, putting skulls back together, things like that to make them look the way they did. And your organ donation, things like that. It is a lot of work to put them back together and make them look like they did. And not all the time will they look the same, but some people are okay with that. They'd rather see their loved one just in general.
Right.
But yeah, cosmetizing. We have things called tissue builder. It's a chemical that we can use to kind of plump up the features and things like that. So there is a lot of stuff we have that we can fix things with.
Wow. And what's the usual turnaround, from death to service?
It depends. I mean, we've had viewings in a couple days from passing. Sometimes we've had to wait a couple weeks, and depending on the trauma, depends on how long it takes to prepare them as well. It could take a couple days to preparation, 1 day for preparation. It just depends.
Yeah, some religions. I know Judaism is like a 48-hour kind of
Muslim
turnaround.
too. They require
Muslim
burial
too.
pretty quickly, but those kind of religions also do not want embalming. So,
Right. Exactly.
and they're aware of that. A lot of religions are aware that if they don't do embalming, they will look a certain way, and they're okay with that. So it just depends.
And I tell people, embalming isn't necessarily the law.
Yeah.
It can be company policy that you don't do a public viewing with a body that's unembalmed, but it's not necessarily the law. So we have done a lot of green burials. We've done a lot of unembalmed burials. Just, it's the family's preference. If nobody's going to view the body, embalming's great. It's wonderful. We're very talented embalmers, but there's no reason to do it if somebody's not going to be viewed.
All right. Well, our conversation with Cameron Noggle and Taylor Sawyer of Noggle Funeral Home and Cremation Services, very interesting. We have a lot more coming up, but coming up next, we're going to talk with Val, and Val is going to talk to us about her experience that she had with her family in the funeral preparation. It's going to be a great conversation, so y'all are going to want to stick around. Millennium Physician Group Radio will return right after this. Welcome back to Millennium Physician Group Radio. I'm Michelle McCormick. Thank you for tuning in today. Our conversation is about funeral planning and learning more about the services a funeral home can offer. I have Val on the phone with us now, and she's going to talk about her experience with her mom. And Cameron Noggle and Taylor Sawyer are with me still here, Val. And when I heard this story from you about this conversation I was having today, I was inspired, and I would love to hear your story again.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. So I was telling Michelle this morning that it was really an interesting day when my mother handed me this card that was from Farley Funeral Home that's in Venice. And she told me, I need you to hold on to this because I went and I picked out everything for my funeral. And I said, you did what? And she said, I went all by myself and I was able to go pick out my casket and what I want done, for the ceremony. And I picked out everything to the T, even my headstone, my plot, everything's being paid for. I have it on a payment plan, and I just want you all to not have to worry about that and, just worry about the celebration of my life when that day comes.
So Val, I find that fascinating, and I really feel like perhaps this was a gift that she gave you.
Oh, it is, because a funeral expense can be, sometimes a burden to some. And so, yeah, absolutely. And to think of what does my mom want? You do a guessing game, I would assume, when that time comes for a loved one.
Yeah. Do you guys experience that, Cameron and Taylor?
A lot.
Yeah, you'd be amazed how many family members, when that time does come, they have no clue what their loved one wants or no clue what their loved one's parents' names were, things like that. So, and I feel like it's less stressful if their arrangements are already pre-made for
Funerals
you.
happen kind of fast. I tease people and say it's like planning a wedding in 5 days.
Right.
You have to get everything together to have a service, religious or non-religious, and then go do something. And getting it all together really quickly is
While
really
you're
stressful.
grieving,
While you're grieving, going through that process is stressful.
Right. And Val, do you feel prepared now for, God forbid, that day happen for your mom?
Oh, yes. I feel extremely blessed. I can't believe that she took that, upon herself to do it. I even said, Mom, why didn't you have me go with you? And she said, because it's something sad. We don't always want to think about something of that nature. But, I just took care of it. I didn't want that burden on you. So, and my mother's such a loving soul. So, of course, she would do that.
Yeah. And the death conversation, and we touched a little bit about this in the first segment, it's a hard one to have. And for your mom to have the forethought to take care of you in that way, I just find truly inspirational.
Yeah.
As a parent. Is that something you think you'll turn around and do for your children, Val?
Oh, absolutely. The role model that my mother has been will only make me be of who I am today.
Yeah. So thank you, Val. We really appreciate you joining us and sharing your experience with your mom's planning. And we're going to get way more into that in the next segment coming up. So we will continue the conversation with Cameron and Taylor from Noggle Funeral Home and Cremation Services. So stick around. Millennium Physician Group Radio will return right after this. Welcome back to Millennium Physician Group Radio. I'm Michelle McCormick. Today our conversation has been really interesting. It's about funerals and death and stuff people don't want to talk about but need to be talking about. We're talking about arranging, pre-planning, knowing in advance what our loved ones and even ourselves, what we want to do. We're going to learn more about the funeral home business. We're talking with one of Jacksonville's oldest businesses, Noggle Funeral Home and Cremation Services, and about the importance of that preparation. So Cameron Noggle is the president and owner of Noggle Funeral Home and Cremation Services, and Taylor Sawyer also joining us as a licensed funeral director and embalmer. So thank you guys for continuing the conversation with me today. All right, let's hit the big one.
Okay.
We just had a great call with Val.
Yeah.
When do we start planning?
I think anytime, I'm 32 and I've already kind of planned mine. And I know I'm in the funeral business, but I always tell people the sooner is better.
Right.
You lock in a rate. If I plan my funeral today, I'm locking in the prices at today's prices. So if I don't pass for 50, 60 years, that price is still the same. Right. So, you have items that aren't guaranteed, like cash advance is what they're called, like death certificates and third-party company things aren't guaranteed. However, the earlier is the better.
Yeah, all of our merchandise, all of our services are guaranteed on pre-needs.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a great question. What is a pre-need?
Pre-need is your pre-arrangement. So we have at need, which means your loved one has passed and you're at need for a service. Pre-need is a pre-arrangement. So you're pre-arranging your funeral or your cremation or whatever you decide to do. So that's what pre-need means.
Okay. All right. So let's kind of walk through that process. My husband and I, we want to come in, we want to do what Val's mother did for her, take care of our children, make sure all the boxes are checked and I's dotted, T's crossed. But we select Noggle and we come to visit. What's next?
I think the first thing is we always get contact information, your address, date of birth, things like that. We have you fill out a demographic form. It's basically asking for your parents' names, your birthplace, things like that we'll need for your death certificate that your family might not know.
Right.
Your usual occupation, things like that. Then we sit down and ask you, what kind of arrangements are you wanting? Do you want cremation? Do you want burial? And then from there, we can pick merchandise, death certificates. You can even prepay for your obituary. You just put an amount down and, go from there.
Well, how do you help the person that's like, I don't know if I want to be buried. I don't know if I want to be cremated. I don't know if I want a pink casket. I don't know if I want a black casket. It's like, oh my goodness, death. How do you help that person get over that hurdle?
And luckily in the pre-need segment, you have time. So time is something that you have. It's an asset. So you can take your time and we can give you a bunch of options and you can go take those and think about it. Unlike, when you're making at-need arrangements, that has to be done soon.
Yeah.
Have somebody that's passed and you need to either cremate or bury them or do something. You have a limited amount of time. Whereas pre-need, you have some time. At least call a funeral home and get an idea.
Options.
Yeah, get options.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's it. I think that's the key right there is get your options, know what you're doing ahead of time, and you really are giving a gift to your loved ones at that point. All right. So Cameron and Taylor, I know you guys do a lot in the community to help with the military families. Veteran services, it's especially in Jacksonville, we have a large military community. How do you handle military families? Do veteran benefits cover costs?
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about that.
I think the number one thing is most veterans, my husband including, always thought that the VA covered your cremation or your burial in full, and they don't. They don't at all, unfortunately. The VA will do reimbursements to families. So what happens is the family has to, or you can do your prearrangement. You have to pay for the funeral, and then you turn around and fill out an application with the bill showing payment for a reimbursement. And depending on, if you're active duty or you were, if you passed in a hospital, or if you're just, a normal veteran, depends on the amount that they will reimburse the family. The average is $300. So if you're a veteran, you've been honorably discharged, you served active duty, they'll give you a $300 reimbursement. Your family does have to have your discharge papers, though, to show proof. And they'll do that reimbursement for you. But that is the only thing they will cover. If you do a burial outside of the National Cemetery, we have a National Cemetery here in Jacksonville. If you do a burial outside of that, they'll reimburse it. It's $796 is what they'll reimburse for that. But that is the only amount that the VA covers.
Wow.
Same with Social Security. People think Social Security or Medicaid will pay something towards their funeral. They don't. Social Security will do a death benefit to the family, but it has to be a spouse or a dependent child.
Right.
Those are the only people that can apply for that death benefit anymore. So
even more paperwork involved.
correct. Yes, lots of paperwork.
Yeah, and you're just not, I'm guessing, thinking
Correct.
In those type of reimbursement, and then maybe it just gets never mind, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, that's why we always say pre-planning is the best, because it's less paperwork when that time comes, but you have everything in place. If Dad is, a Navy veteran and he is determined to be buried at the National Cemetery, he can pre-arrange, he can even pre-qualify through the VA for burial. All that can be done prior to him ever passing. So that's why we always say pre-planning is the best option for anyone. Less stress, and everything can be done ahead of time.
Yeah.
So you have that time to grieve.
It makes sense because it's too much.
Yeah.
And then, which leads me to another service that that Noggle Funeral Home and Cremation Services offers, and that's grief services.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about what you offer in that respect.
So we sit down and talk with families. We also have a number of contacts for hospice and grief care groups that they can go to.
There's a lot of groups that will meet, like if you're a widower and you've lost your wife, there's a lot of groups that will, only women that have lost their husbands, they meet and they'll even do trips and things like that. There's always options. Hospice here in Jacksonville, Community Hospice, is great with grief counseling and things like that. A lot of churches around town also will do grief counseling. And I know a lot of people they're like, oh, counseling, I don't want to go. It is a good option. Everyone grieves and everyone grieves differently. So it's good to get out there and, work with people that are going through the same thing.
And some people, grieve delayed. And so I tell people, some people feel guilty about not grieving as much at the beginning and grieving more, in the end, everybody does it differently. It's all
and people, I think, might still be in like some kind of shock.
Correct.
Yeah.
Like this, and then it's overwhelming the amount of things they have to do for preparation and whatnot, especially if it's a sudden death, unexpected. All right, so Cameron and Taylor are from Noggle Funeral Home and Cremation Services, and I can't not have a conversation about what's happening in our world right now. How has COVID affected the funeral business? I mean, I know during this time last year or even earlier, the 18 months ago, if someone passed away, you couldn't even have a funeral. Right. Let's talk about how that has impacted your business.
I think COVID has definitely made our business busier.
Yeah.
We have to be more cautious now as far as, if the person does have COVID, being more protected, wearing different, PPEs is what we call them, protective gear, things like that. It has done an increase, I think, in the business.
Yeah. It has ushered in a lot of technology that was kind of not in our industry. Our
let's talk about that.
Old industry.
Yeah.
It's slow to change. Funeral directors are the most resistant to change of people I've known.
Yeah.
In fact, my office 8 years ago probably didn't have a computer in it from when my aunt and uncle ran it. There were, everything was done on books and in paper. But we have set up a lot of webcasting, a lot of being able to stream services.
DocuSigns, things like that.
DocuSigns where people can remotely sign documents and verify it.
Yeah.
And, there's even an online portal on our website where somebody can arrange a cremation at need on our website. So without coming in, and we can do, back and forth over.
We prefer to meet in person just because it's more personal, but we understand, if you don't want to be in contact and, if your loved one had COVID and you were in contact with them, we understand you need to make the arrangements, but not in person. So we can do everything electronically. We do have options for if we have a viewing and family can't come here because of COVID, if they're in a different country, we do Zoom.
Or different state,
we do Zoom so they can view their loved one from this state to that state and things like that.
We even have a big screen in our chapel, and we had a father who was in New York who wanted to do part of this service, and so we mic'd the TV, and he was able to do his service part from his living room, and deliver that in front of the rest of the family that were there.
Yeah. Were you able to do graveside services at that time?
There were kind of rules, like at the National Cemetery, you couldn't have over, I think it was like 10 people. Yeah. You had to wear a mask. Everyone had to stand 6 feet apart, and they did sanitize the caskets before they would take them. So there is, certain cemeteries would only allow so many people. Mm-hmm. Even in our chapel, when it was really bad, we didn't, we had a limited amount. So it is difficult, especially, how busy we got and things like that. And, but you kind of work through it and you have to help the families.
Yeah. Right. And of course you guys were considered essential.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. We never got a day off.
Right.
Yeah. We did not get to work from home.
It was very poignant though. A lot of our manufacturers and a lot of people that provide funeral merchandise sent us, they called it last responder videos, celebrating last responders and people that come in.
Yeah.
Well, that's an excellent point. Yeah. I mean, we definitely had our first responders being heralded as heroes, but as the last responders, you guys are the ones kind of cleaning up at the end,
Yeah.
But it's like you've been saying, death is not really something people want to talk about and you bring to light. So we just kind of sit back and do what we need to.
Yeah. Well, Cameron Noggle and Taylor Sawyer are from Noggle Funeral Home and Cremation Services. Now, let me ask, ballpark.
Yeah.
How much does a funeral cost?
So ballpark with cemetery property, I believe the national average is $10,000. So you're looking at probably $4,000 to $5,000 in a grave space if you buy a grave space or don't own one, and then probably $4,000 to $5,000 in funeral costs.
Yeah. How do you help families with that sudden cost, besides the pre-planning, which we encourage?
Pre-planning is always the best option. Just because with pre-planning too, you can do payments and stuff like that, so it does make it a little bit easier. I think when you present the $10,000 bill to someone, it's never easy. No matter what your income is, or that's a lot of money for a lot of people, especially with COVID. A lot of people lost their jobs and things like that, so it has been a struggle. But we work with families, if we, find a better financial option for you, we can. Yeah. And like Cameron was saying, cremation is always, financially a better option, but you do have people that don't want cremation.
Right. Or natural burial. There's a lot of places where we've gone to the National Cemetery and buried a veteran and nobody was going to view it, so we didn't have to embalm. So that takes a lot off the bill, the viewing, the visitation, the embalming.
Okay, so still very personal preference. Yeah. Okay.
Cremation is always a lot, less expensive. Our cremation is $12.45, so it is less expensive. But you have those families that want burial, which is fine. But like we've been talking about, if you do your pre-arrangements, that $10,000 can be broken down throughout, a couple of years. So that's not as big as a financial burden on you.
Right.
Okay. Well, maybe you don't know the answer to this question, but is it illegal to throw ashes off of a cruise ship? And I ask because my in-laws were dead set on this happening, and they pretty much had to sneak around the boat and throw ashes off the side.
If you're in international waters and you've alerted the captain to what you're doing, he can do a service and fill out a sheet and scatter the ashes at sea in international waters. The thing that you run into is when a lot of people go and scatter them, in the St. Johns River or at the beach or something like that. And while the legality of that is in question, it's illegal for us. But for a family, I don't know that anybody's going to lock up grandma for putting grandpa's ashes at the beach.
Yeah. But we cannot go and do that.
Right.
Do that for you.
Right.
Let's be clear.
Yes, let's be very clear. They are not doing that.
No.
Right.
No.
Right.
All right. So when we come back, Cameron and Taylor from Noggle Funeral Home and Cremation Services are going to wrap up the conversation with the top 3 takeaways. I already know one of the biggest one, pre-plan.
Yes.
And we're also going to learn how you can get in touch with them. So you're definitely going to want to stick around for that. The conversation will continue. Millennium Physician Group Radio will return right after this. Welcome back to Millennium Physician Group Radio. I'm Michelle McCormick. Our conversation today has been, it's been a good conversation about funeral homes. What are they? What do they do? Why it's important to make arrangements ahead of time for you and your loved ones. We've been talking with Cameron Noggle and Taylor Sawyer from Noggle Funeral Home and Cremation Services, and you guys have been a wealth of information. So thank you very much. Now, we have some takeaways that we want the listeners to leave with today. Let's go through those real quick.
Yeah. I think number one is pre-planning. That, pre-planning is not only good for yourself, but it helps your family when, that time does come. They're already having to grieve about your loss. Give them one last thing that they don't have to worry about, both financially and the hardship of figuring out what you wanted.
I tell people it's great to have insurance, and insurance is a great thing, but usually that's to care for the living after you pass. A pre-plan is something you can set in place and not have to worry about. Do I have enough money in this?
Yeah.
Now, is pre-planning something that they can just put in their will? Or is this, this is completely separate.
Yeah, you have to do a contract with the funeral home. The funeral home has a trust, is what we call it. So the funeral home can choose. We put 100% of our pre-needs into a trust. So what that means is if you were to pay me $6,000 for your funeral, 100% of those funds go into a trust. So if you don't pass for 20, 30 years, that trust is built up to cover the additional cost of your funeral. So, there's different options, but if you put it in your will, there are chances that you won't get what you want. So pre-planning is the best option for if to make sure you have your final arrangements the way you want. If you have children that don't get along and you want Sally to have your remains over Joe, your pre-arrangements can allow that to happen instead of the children fighting over who gets mom. Okay. So that's a good thing too.
Yeah. So what else do we need to leave with today?
I think right now with COVID, there is, FEMA has approved for COVID reimbursement for people. A lot of people, when their loved one passed of COVID, they themselves financially were in a bad spot. So FEMA has approved to where a family, if the death certificate says COVID as a cause of death, you can apply for reimbursement through them. You just have to provide the death certificate showing that and show the bill, and they will, reimburse you for $7,000 of the funeral cost. So that's very important for people to know.
That is very significant.
Yeah.
Tell us how we can find out more information. And I know your website is extremely robust. So tell us what it is.
Sure. It's www.nauglefuneral.com.
And that NAUGLE.
FUNERAL.com.
Yeah, very robust. I found one of the sections on the site about merchandise extremely interesting. And we were just talking at the end of the last segment about ashes and scattering. You guys have some interesting ash products on the site.
There's a lot of things. People think that, when someone's cremated, all they can do is just have this urn in their house. And there's so many options. Yeah. You can put your loved one in a tree and grow a tree at your house. There's wind chimes. You can send them off to space. NASA has a great program that you can send your loved one to space if they love stuff like that.
Yeah.
You mentioned a cane.
Yes.
Yeah. They make a walking stick that has a GPS in it, and it's got a little drop spreader in the foot of it. And as you walk along, it drops a little bit out as you hike. And so if they had a favorite trail, if they were hiking, you can take their favorite trail and scatter them a little bit along the way.
Yeah, and some keepsake jewelry.
Yeah, fingerprint jewelry, keepsake jewelry. We have all kinds of options.
So memories forever.
Yes.
Yeah, they make little beads that fit on Pandora bracelets that have a little bit of the ashes blown into the glass.
Oh, I think that's wonderful.
Yeah. So it's not just an urn anymore. There's so many options for people and you can even, if you have multiple children, all the children can have some. So there's just different options for people.
Well, and I thank you guys for what you do. I find it fascinating, and I really appreciate you being here today. Give us your phone number and your website one more time.
Yes. Our phone number is 904-396-1611, and our website is www.nauglefuneral.com, which is NAUGLE funeral.com.
All right. Well, Cameron Naugle, president of Naugle Funeral Home and Cremation Services, and Taylor Sawyer, funeral director and licensed funeral director and embalmer. Yep. At the young age. Breaking through. I really appreciate you guys being here today and really great conversation.
Thank you.
Our conversation will continue next time on Millennium Physician Group Radio. Your healthcare journey is important to us, and our goal at Millennium Physician Group is to work together to achieve the best health outcome for you, and that, of course, starts with seeing your primary care provider. See our website for a full list of offices and providers at millenniumphysician.com. In good health, I'm Michelle McCormick. So long for now.